All right, you ready for this?
Ready?
Hey everyone, Tom Salemi here. Welcome to this episode of the Device Talks Weekly Podcast. This week, we're going to explore the increasingly important element of connecting medical devices. That's the ability of devices to either talk to doctors and patients to doctors, just the ability for your devices to be more than just a therapeutic tool. I feel like we've been discussing this or promising medtech connectivity for years. But as you'll hear today, and as we've mentioned in the past, COVID-19 has really changed everything. It's really accelerated everything. And what we were planning to do someday is actually having to be done now. I mean, the inability of patients to go see their doctors just prove that we need to have a backup plan, and that payers and regulators need to open up to the possibility that we don't need to go to the doctor's office if I've got a tick bite or poison ivy or even a follow-up to a surgery. There's ways to get around it via telehealth. There's ways to check on patients via connected medtech. So medtech can actually handle a lot of the load, and we're going to hear about that. In a moment, we're going to visit with two very experienced medical professionals. One is Dr. David Hayes. He's the relatively new Chief Medical Officer of Biotronik, and he comes to the discussion as a physician. He was a cardiologist at Mayo for a few decades and opted to join Biotronik earlier this year. So we'll hear about his earlier views as a physician on remote monitoring. And interestingly enough, he'll share his early thoughts on whether or not remote monitoring and connected tech was even necessary or even desired in medtech. And then we'll hear about how he's working today with Biotronik to explore the potential for their products. And next, we'll talk with our old friend, Bill Betton. Bill's been a long-time supporter of Device Talks, and now he's the Director of Solutions of MedTech at a really cool firm called S3 Connected Health. S3 is actually heading up a Device Talks Tuesday conversation we're having on this coming Tuesday. It's called How Can MedTech Win the Connectivity Race and What Happens Next? And S3 is working with MedTech firms on developing their own connected strategies. Bill's been a long-time proponent of this, and we'll get into that in the discussion with him. But it was clear to everyone who watched MedTech's response to COVID-19 that those companies that had plans in place were really able to pivot and to distinguish themselves from others during the pandemic. So Bill will be talking about the importance of those strategies, and I'm really looking forward to sharing that expertise with you. For more information about this Device Talks Tuesday, sponsored by S3 Connected Health, go to devicetalks.com. But before we get into this discussion about connected medtech, let's visit with my podcast partner, Chris Newmarker, the executive editor of Life Sciences at Mass Device. Chris Newmarker, how are we today on this fine Friday?
Hey, we're doing well. Yeah, a nice sunny day here in Minneapolis, so can't complain.
Great. So we want to sort of refine our presentation of Mass Devices. You guys cover so much during the week, and there's so much going on in medtech. We thought this would be a great opportunity for us to just really hone on what the top 5 articles of the week will be. So folks ending the week can kind of just get a sense of what were the high points, what were people reading, because that's really the right barometer, right? What are people looking at? So let's start at we can rank them 5 to 1, or would you rather just kind of hit upon?
Yeah, I think let's just talk about things that are that have been well read. Kind of so we'll just call let's call it a Mass Device top 5.
We don't want to hurt any feelings. So yeah. So what was what was our first of the most 5 well-read articles on Mass Device this week?
We had news earlier this week that FDA approved Edwards Lifesciences ready to implant Connect Resilia aortic valve conduit. That's a mouthful, but I mean, kind of the basic thing is that it's for these very complex procedures called Biobental procedures, where you're replacing somebody's aortic valve, or aortic root, the ascending aorta, and Edwards was saying surgeons sometimes have to do this, actually a third of the time they have to do this in an emergency setting, and kind of the big deal about this is that this is they're saying this is the first pre-assembled option that's FDA approved. So really interesting technology out of Edwards. So I mean that's definitely been one of the most read stories on the site this week. Another story that really caught people's eyes, it caught my attention, was that Abbott and Edwards settled a bunch of patent spats related to transcatheter mitral and tricuspid repair products. This transcatheter aortic valve replacements, that's already a very hot area in medtech, and transcatheter mitral repair replacement, that's kind of like the next big hot area, and they've been fighting all these patent battles over it, and they kind of like buried the hatchet and came to some terms over stuff. And the thing that I think is really interesting about this story is that it comes about a week after Medtronic and Tandem Diabetes Care, they said that they were burying the hatchet on their patent disagreements over insulin pump tech. So I mean, one more of these types of stories, I almost feel like we're going to have a trend here.
Yeah, this came up on our Device Talks Tuesdays a couple of weeks ago too, where the sentiment of attorneys is that there's just such a backlog in courts that people are just opting for settlements because they just don't know when things are going to get really restarted in earnest again. So, like you, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw more of these coming down the pike. Next, we have some robot news. It seems a couple of bits of robot news. Let's start with. Are we saying Smith plus nephew now? Is that how we're saying it?
Yeah, I know. They put a little plus sign in there instead of ampersand. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in that marketing meeting, debating, should we keep the ampersand or do a plus sign? So, they announced, they were launching their next gen CORI surgical system. This is a robotic knee surgery system, and this is kind of their next gen thing. Stryker's had a lot of success with its Mako robotic systems. So all the other big companies in the space have been kind of like trying to compete with this. Zimmer Biomet, Johnson and Johnson, and here's Smith and Nephew. They already had their previous Navio system. Now they've got the CORI robotic platform, and they're kind of touting that it's faster than the Navio system, that that it's it can handle twice the cutting volume, and that they're also saying like, hey, we design in a way we could scale this to use for other types of orthopedic surgeries. So this is kind of definitely like Smith and Nephew making a play here to to kind of try to get more competitive in this space. And it'll be interesting to see like what else we see get released over the next year or two. And and that actually plays into a story that just broke today, which is that Johnson and Johnson, this is an ortho surgery now. Now we're going to talk about general surgery robots, which is a space that Intuitive Surgical pioneered. They're still like the dominant player in this. J&J and Medtronic, they've been really working on their own technologies to get in there and compete with Intuitive. And J&J during their earnings call yesterday, their executives, and they're kind of saying, it kind of seems like they're saying they're going to take their time a bit on this. They said they're not going to follow a 510K clearance pathway. There's some mention to the fact that they've been talking a lot to regulatory authorities around the world. So maybe they just got the sense that whatever, they're doing is different enough that, they're not going to do a clearance pathway with it. So they're going to do some they're going to take a longer road here. And, so now they're talking about doing first in human studies by the second half of 2022. So
one of the 5 most read articles in Mass Device was an interesting acquisition by Medtronic. Why don't you tell us about that?
They're definitely continuing to shop around, and I recall that Jeff Martha was saying that they felt they were in a good enough cash position to do acquisitions right now, and they're buying France-based spinal surgery tech company Metacrea, and it's interesting because Metacrea, they've got software, adaptive intelligence, a lot of things to like help with the preoperative planning, and that seems to play in really well to kind of like this whole ecosystem around spine surgery that Medtronic's been creating, including with robots. I mean, they bought Mazor, and Mazor is becoming a really hot area for them, with the robot assisted spine surgery. So this seems like something that I kind of just even boosted anymore. Like they even talked about like an integrated solution, including artificial intelligence, getting the AI in there. So yeah, that's kind of exciting too. I mean, he's still working a lot of innovation. So it's exciting to see MedTech still. We aren't at a standstill here. We're just frozen.
No, sir. We're moving forward. All right. Well, lots of great stuff on Mass Device. Those are just 5 of the stories. So I invite people to go to massdevice.com and check it out for themselves. And Chris Newmarker, thanks for giving us the top 5.
Hey, always a pleasure, Tom. Take care.
All right. So now you have a lay of the land. That was the week in MedTech. Thanks to Chris Newmarker and the team at Mass Device for chronicling MedTech events. Now let's get into this week's conversation about connected MedTech. I first spoke with Dr. David Hayes. As I said at the top, he's now the Chief Medical Officer at Biotronik. He said he joined earlier this year after last year deciding he needed a change. His term was up as the head of cardiology at Mayo. Apparently they have term limits there, and I didn't realize that, 2 4-year limits. So he, after several decades as a cardiologist, decided he wanted to do something different, and had always enjoyed the people at Biotronik and enjoyed the company and its products. So the opportunity came for him to join, and he came aboard as CMO and came aboard just prior to the pandemic, and has spent the past few months sort of helping Biotronik, as other device companies are doing, navigate this new terrain. So in this conversation, we talked about Biotronik's connected technologies, what they're capable of, and why they're important. And I'll also talk with Dr. Hayes about his changing stance on connected MedTech. Let's listen. Well, Dr. David Hayes, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
How is Biotronik using its technology and adapting it to operate in this COVID world? I know you had the BioMonitor study that you filed that talked about the temperature sensing capabilities of your devices. Are you finding opportunities to sort of heighten connectivity and connectivity capabilities or connected capabilities of your devices, and how they might help treat or detect people with the virus?
Yeah, it's a very important and timely question. The most important thing is that, with implantable cardiac devices, we've had for 20 years what we call remote monitoring. And in fact, Biotronik was the pioneer in that technology. And I've told people, because this is true, that in 2000, Biotronik came to me as a key opinion leader, quote unquote, in the field, to explain their home monitoring. That's the name of the remote monitoring system. And they were the first. And I actually have a slide that lists these. I went through about 8 reasons why it would never work. Patients wouldn't accept it, physicians wouldn't accept it, on and on and on. I have been proven wrong on every single point. And I've said that long before I went to Biotronik with this job. But the difference in Biotronik's home monitoring and others' remote monitoring is patients that have a device, they get a little gadget that has its own power source. It doesn't need any special connectivity. It's got worldwide cellular connectivity. So it's really plug and play. So they get that. There's a daily transmission. So it's really this security blanket for all concerned. The patient most importantly, but also for their physicians, that there is a daily interrogation, a daily download of information about what's going on with their device. And if there are some issues, those are set up in a traffic light system so that alerts are issued back to the physician. So we've been relying on this for a long time, but now in the COVID era, to get to your question, it's even more important because patients just almost really rarely need to come in to be seen for a routine check. It can all be done remotely. One of the other things is when I was implanting, we would keep our patients, our new implants, overnight to make sure that everything looked okay the next day, even though it's been proven patients could go home and come back the next day, minimize that night stay in the hospital. But with the Biotronik home monitoring, it's possible for them to go home right after the implant, minimize their time, especially when they're concerned about COVID-19, go home, have the device check remotely the next day, and avoid that completely. And Biotronik recently added a feature whereby a physician on demand can ask for a quick check or an on-demand check and get a response in less than 10 minutes. So that if a patient called me right now and said, I've had a shock, I'm concerned about what's going on, as the physician, I could contact Biotronik. They could do an automatic query, and I'd have that information in 10 minutes. So we've really tried to optimize that remote monitoring, home monitoring capability.
How do you see Biotronik moving forward to really heighten your connected capabilities and really sort of playing a larger role in, I guess, not only managing heart disease, but perhaps giving patients and physicians the opportunity to measure other conditions as well, including potential viruses like this one?
Yeah, I think, first of all, the pandemic in general, as we've seen the need to rely more on telemedicine and telehealth, right, and as the government eased the regulatory requirements for doing so, because it hasn't really been for a long time a technology issue, it's been an issue of licensing and regulatory issues. And because of the immense and efficient usage of this since the pandemic, there's no putting that genie back in the bottle. We're going to need to continue doing this, and patients love it. So to your point, the temperature sensing, honestly, I didn't even realize, because it's not something we had previously sought FDA approval for, but that was a capability of our BioMonitor 3, the implantable loop recorder. So then when we started looking back at some of that data that is available, we saw some really interesting correlations of patients that had suspected COVID, and the fact that what might be a really fairly low-grade temperature elevation was showing up in the data that was collected on these daily transmissions. But so that in itself is a relatively limited issue. But again, it's just one more thing to think about, that if a patient has a device that can also monitor temperature, whether it be for COVID or if it's looking for some post-operative infection or anything that can cause a systemic febrile response, it could be important. It also means that we will double down on looking at other disease management, and one of the big ones will be for heart failure. We've got resynchronization devices that we use very successfully for heart failure patients. We collect a lot of that data, but I think now it will become incumbent on us to say, how can we even more effectively collect, analyze, and clinically utilize that data to optimize quality of life for our heart failure patients. Same will be true for other chronic disease issues like diabetes and hypertension, a number of other things.
Do you see physicians, or have you seen physicians using your systems to monitor those patients who have not wanted to come into the hospitals, and perhaps checking those numbers and saying, yes, I know you're scared, but you need to get in here? Is that going to be how things are managed going forward, that there may be you're checking the data obviously anyway, but is this going to be something to give patients the prod they need to come in and get the necessary treatment?
I think one of the main things that we'll do for cardiac implantable devices is, historically we've had our defibrillator patients come in for an in-clinic check on a fairly routine basis. Pacemaker patients used to all the time, now a little bit less so, but what we found is that those routine are usually non-actionable. Everything's fine, there's no need to do anything. So I believe that what this will drive us to is doing more of those routine, non-actionable checks remotely, and only bringing people in when there's a suspicion that we need to actively do something. We need to have them in the office for programming, or perhaps they need another procedure. And I think for heart failure patients, even though we've already seen that paying attention to the monitored data that we have available, that we can minimize readmit or heart failure hospitalizations for patients if we're carefully watching that data. I think we'll just get better at synthesizing that data and looking for the early warning signs and minimizing somebody going from early heart failure into marked decompensation.
Do you see going forward that technologies or new devices developed within Biotronik and perhaps others outside of the company that you may or may not, that you may look at as partners or potential, will they need to have some comprehensive connected function? I mean, is this just an assumption now that most medtech devices are going to need to have an ability to connect patients with physicians?
I think that yes, I think the implanted devices definitely need to have that connection to be able to collect the data and successfully understand how to use the data you're collecting, because it hasn't always been the case. I also think that we will need to find the optimal way to pass that information on to our patients. You know, we could easily overwhelm patients with data because patients more and more want to know what's going on. Some of them want direct access. Many of them want direct access to the data. So we have to figure out how to best connect with them through our app, which is available. What data should we share with them, and in a way that's going to be useful to them. So more and more for patients with chronic disease management, I think that'll be increasingly important.
What changed in 2000? You said that patients will never accept it, physicians will never accept it. What didn't you, remote monitoring tech, what didn't you foresee? What's different?
Yeah, so it was a lot because I, again, was wrong on really every point. But, you know, we had all of these patients that really liked coming in and seeing the nurses, especially, that they talked to on the phone 2 out of the 3 months or whatever it was. And I thought they'll miss that connection. But patients love the efficiency of not having to drive somewhere and find parking and everything else. I was concerned that we would be so overwhelmed with the data that it would cause more work rather than less work. But we've proven that it decreased, and in very specific trials Biotronik has done, that it may decrease workload by as much as 40% for clinic personnel. I also thought that what if you got data that came in on a Friday night and it wasn't looked at until Monday and something happened over the weekend? What about litigation? In fact, just the opposite has been proven in the very early, it was Biotronik study, it was called the TRUST study. What we found is that problems were identified on average more than 30 days earlier with home monitoring than they were with conventional office visits. So actually, from the standpoint of protecting the patient, it was just the opposite of what I projected. And to my knowledge, there's been no precedent case about what I was concerned about in 2000. So, you know, you could just check them off one by one, and truly, I was wrong on every one.
Technology certainly has developed quickly since 2000, and at that time it was accelerating at an alarming pace. But excellent. Well, thank you for your time and your candor, and I really enjoyed talking to you.
No, thanks for having me. Appreciate the time. Take care.
All right, next we're going to talk with Bill Betton. As I mentioned at the top, Bill is working with a firm called S3 Connected Health. S3 is helping medtech companies to develop their strategies, to help develop their technologies so they are ready for the connected world. And Bill will talk with me and David Knapp, the Vice President of Research and Development at Boston Scientific, on the upcoming Device Talks Tuesdays. So go to devicetalks.com. It's really a fascinating discussion. As I said, we've been talking about connected health for a very long time, but it's clear that the time is now for having one of these plans in place. We're no longer telling you to eat your vegetables. This is a need to have. So I hope you'll check out devicetalks.com and make sure that you're joining us on Tuesday at 4 p.m. So now let's get into this conversation with Bill Betton of S3 Connected Health. Well, Bill Betton, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Tom. Glad to be here.
All right, Bill. So we have gone through 4 months of COVID-19. This has afforded the opportunity for medtech companies to respond differently. How overall did the sector respond to the new demands and the new realities of the pandemic?
We did see a pretty good pivot. I think every startup in the world who could possibly link their startup to something to do with COVID-19 tried to make that pivot. So there were a lot of new apps, new uses, new things that came out. But in reality, 4 months isn't very long in terms of development for a traditional med device or even an app. So it's really hard to say we invented something brand new for this. But there were interesting examples. For example, the hearing aid business. Immediately you saw a number of the largest hearing aid manufacturers, which traditionally have relied upon going to audiologists, being fitted, getting your hearing aid in a very structured, controlled environment. They immediately announced the ability to fit via telemonitoring and remote fitting and that sort of thing. So they pivoted very quickly. Again, for an auxiliary use, which is hearing aids, using capabilities that they probably had in place, but it forced a change in their business model because people couldn't go to the audiologist and get fitted. So a big impact, primarily though with regard to changes in regulations that allowed people to get doctors and physicians and clinics to get paid for telemedicine visits.
So clearly the technology has not changed over those 4 months, but where we're seeing the changes are in the regulations, in the reimbursement. How long lasting are you, or how permanent, I should say, are you anticipating those changes will be? Have we sort of, as an industry and as a society, have we turned the page to where these telehealth and these remote monitoring opportunities are here to stay?
Boy, I hope so, but I think there's a big concern about what happens after the current crisis passes. I've been doing telemedicine for over 25 years. I go back to the days of DICOM and teleradiology and sending images around the U.S. Now we're in the era where everybody's got a computer in their pocket and teleconnectivity, and we're connecting $50 weight scales and $100 pulse oximeters. And so we have the technical capability to connect all these things and do it. So as a technical person, it's gratifying to see the technical changes that have evolved. But some of the things you mentioned are really structural, or I'll call them infrastructure for our medical system. The changes that were implemented with the changes in regulations, the reimbursement, that facilitates it. It puts the money in being able to utilize some of the services that have been around for a while. I do think there's a very valid concern that's been evidenced by both physicians and the med device companies that say, what happens after COVID-19? I know there's been a letter to the Center for Medicare Services talking about, can we keep some of these regulations and reimbursements in effect afterwards? I'm hopeful that will be the case. I think this has alerted people to the fact that they should be considering how to connect their devices and their technology, because even if it's not directly related to COVID, you find out that how hard it is to do things. You can't always do things in person. So whether it's working from home or visiting a doctor or doing whatever, we're finding that perhaps teleconnection is a good way to go.
Well, that's actually a great point, because we've been talking about the need for medtech startups to have a connectivity plan. You and I had talked previously for an article I was writing, and you said every medtech needs to have a plan. In a way, though, at the time, it sounded like almost like the old Asia strategy used to sound, when every company had to have an Asia strategy. Whether they were going to go in Asia or not, it was just a good thing to have in the toolbox. But lo and behold, here we are. Those companies that had a connectivity plan were able to pivot and to move really quickly. So I think this really demonstrated the importance of those plans. So what does a connectivity plan? What does it look like, and how do startups sort of need to approach this?
Well, and it's not just startups; it's the large companies, the tier ones as well. But so you need to think about who are your users are going to be, both for the therapy or the device or the app, whatever it is. Think of your users first. What's your business model? Are you in the business of diagnosing or treating something? Or are you at a point where you're saying, I'm going to be a services provider and do analytics on data? What's going to happen with the data? What are you going to gather? Where's it going to go? Security is a huge issue. None of us want to be hacked for anything, whether it's financial data, health data, or just our personal identity. So where's all that stuff going to go? And you need to take all of that into account in designing, and I'm going to take a hardware-centric view initially. When I'm building that device, I'm going to look at it and say, what information am I going to need out of it, and where's it got to go? And I should build that connectivity in right away. I urge people when they're doing new hardware designs, because the design cycles are long, the approval cycles are long, and the changes to hardware and software are monitored. So if you're going to do it, design it in, even if you don't have a plan in place initially. Because if you've got the hardware there, then software upgrades and enabling that make it a little bit easier. And finally, then after you've got that in place, I really encourage people to consider what your strategy is. I touched on elements of that, but I work with a company called S3 Connected Health, and we'll be talking about this in our Device Talks Tuesday next week. A company needs to have its strategy in place, and we'll work with them to define and outline that strategy. It's always better if you have a strategy before you go into the product development, but in some cases you can go back and retrofit it afterwards. You can't, however, if you haven't made provision for gathering that data.
And you mentioned Device Talks Tuesday. We're fortunate to have David Knapp of Boston Scientific appearing with you on that webinar. And that's an example of a company that has had a plan in place and has been executing. And tell us a bit as to what David will be talking about on Tuesday and what Boston Scientific has accomplished.
Well, I won't speak for Boston Scientific, but I'm pleased to have David join me in the discussion of how companies are transitioning from being device-centric to being patient-centric, up to and including the services that you can offer in connected health. And so David and I will be talking about that with you. And David specifically will be providing an example of how Boston Scientific has developed a product using connectivity to provide new and improved capabilities and improve healthcare for patients. So we're both excited about talking about this evolution in technology and where it's headed. And he should have a great example showing how Boston Scientific is addressing that as well.
That'll be great. Two great perspectives. And final question, just I guess I'm asking you to put on your future hat or your future goggles. What does this all look like, say, 4 or 5 years from now? How does the integration of digital tech, connectivity, and med tech look like?
Wow! In 5 years, I expect to see a database of me as an individual in healthcare. Real quickly, after years of doing this, I had my first personal telemedicine visit with my physician about a month ago as a follow-up to surgery I'd had a year previous. It worked well, and it was because he had access to the data. I stayed within my health plan. He had access to all my data, so he could pull up my MRIs, he could have access to all the lab results, and it worked really well. There are many systems in which that wouldn't work, because if I had wandered outside of the confines of his EHR and what he was doing, he wouldn't have access to that. So I'm hopeful that we will have a database of connected information that is mine. I think we'll have a network of connected devices, the so-called Internet of Medical Things, which will allow devices to talk and communicate and be integrated. Not just weight scales and pulse oximeters, but pacemakers and defibrillators and blood glucose meters and all those devices that will contribute to monitoring my health from a holistic viewpoint, as opposed to a individualized application-specific area. And that would allow us to put together best of breed and look at all the information going on for me from a holistic viewpoint. And I hope we will have moved from being a reactive medical system where we're treating a condition or an episode to a situation where we're treating things proactively, where we're monitoring the health ahead of time and taking care to really impact the behavior of the individual by giving them more knowledge about what's going on. I think then finally, it's really enabling information flow from the physician to the patient and to the patient's loved ones, whether it's at the hospital and clinic, whether it's in a home environment, or it's when I go mobile and am living an active retired life or something like that, or living with my condition. So I'm hopeful that that's the case from a technological point of view. In order for that to happen, we're going to have regulatory changes, we're going to have reimbursement changes, and we go back to that infrastructure modification that I talked about.
I certainly hope that we do see those changes coming. I mean, we do have the tech. We just need the will, and as we've seen, unfortunately, during all of this, sometimes the will is the hardest thing to muster. So I'm really excited, though. I think this is an opportunity to grow from this experience, and it's going to be a fascinating conversation on Tuesday. Thanks for being part of it.
Thanks very much. Look forward to a more extended conversation on Tuesday.
All right, well, that is a wrap. Thank you so much for joining us on this week's Device Talks Weekly podcast. I hope you enjoyed this conversation about connectivity. Hope you enjoyed the update on the Mass Device Top 5 articles from a podcast partner, Chris Newmarker of Mass Device. If you want to find Chris on social media, he is at Newmarker, as in a new marker. That's his Twitter handle. You can also find him on LinkedIn. I am on LinkedIn, Tom Salemi, and you can find me on Twitter at MedTechTom. Please reach out to both of us. Please share this podcast on social media and connect to both Chris and myself so we can be part of that conversation. Finally, do us a quick favor. Would you please subscribe to the podcast? Give us a rating, give us a rankings, give us some comments, and let your friends know about the podcast. We'd love to have more people listening. That's it, folks. Tune in on Tuesday. We'll have our Device Talks Tuesday. How can MedTechs win the connectivity race, and what happens next? And of course, tune in next week. We'll have another great episode of the Device Talks Weekly podcast for you.